You ever notice how some people don't leave you loudly, they leave you emotionally? They stay in your life, they reply, they show up when it's convenient, but something always feels distant, like you are speaking to someone standing behind glass. And the more you try to reach them, the more they seem to move just slightly further away, without ever fully disappearing. That kind of connection doesn't feel like rejection in the beginning. It feels like mystery. It feels like depth. It feels like maybe you just need to love a little harder, be a little more patient, understand them a little more. But over time, it starts to feel like confusion wrapped in hope, and hope wrapped in exhaustion. This is where most people misunderstand what they are dealing with. They think emotional distance is a problem of misunderstanding, when in reality, it is often a pattern of protection. There are people who don't run from love because they don't feel it. They run from it because they feel it too deeply, too fast, and too overwhelming to hold. And instead of learning how to stay present with that intensity, they learn how to step back from it. Not because they want to hurt anyone, but because closeness starts to feel like losing control of themselves. Now here is where something unusual happens. Because most people respond to this distance by chasing, they try harder, explain more, prove more, give more. But there is one type of emotional presence that does not trigger pursuit or panic. It does not chase. It does not collapse into overgiving. It does not punish or withdraw in retaliation. It simply remains steady, and that steadiness does something unexpected. It doesn't push the distant person further away. It quietly starts dissolving their defenses from the inside. This is not loud love. This is not dramatic love. This is not the kind of connection that demands attention. It is something far more subtle and far more powerful, because instead of trying to force closeness, it creates safety. And safety is what many emotionally avoidant people have never fully experienced in relationships. They are used to intensity, unpredictability, emotional pressure, or emotional hunger. So when they encounter someone who does not react from fear, does not chase from insecurity, and does not demand emotional proof every few hours, something inside them starts to shift. At first, they don't understand it. They may even underestimate it, because when someone is used to emotional chaos, calmness can feel unimpressive, but slowly, that calmness becomes unsettling in a different way. It becomes noticeable, it becomes memorable, it becomes something they can't fully explain but also can't fully ignore. Because for the first time, they are not being pulled, pressured, or pursued. They are simply being seen without being chased. And this is where the dynamic begins to change. There is a rare emotional presence that does not compete with distance. It does not fight it. It does not try to fix it. Instead, it reflects it back without judgment. It lets the distance exist without turning it into panic. And that creates something emotionally unfamiliar for someone who is used to avoiding closeness. It creates space where they don't feel trapped, but also don't feel forgotten. This is the moment where avoidance begins to lose its power, not because it is forced out, but because it is no longer needed as a defense. When someone no longer reacts dramatically to your distance, you are left alone with your own emotional patterns, and that is something many people are not prepared for. Because distance used to protect them from emotional overwhelm. But now distance starts to feel like emotional silence that they themselves are responsible for filling. So something subtle begins to happen. They don't come closer because they are told to. They come closer because the emotional environment finally allows it without pressure. And ironically, the less pressure they feel, the more they start to notice what was always there underneath their avoidance. The need for connection, the curiosity, the pull they have been suppressing for so long. But this is not a simple transformation. It is not sudden. It is not linear. It comes in waves. One moment they feel safe and open, and the next moment they feel the urge to retreat again. Because closeness still carries emotional weight for them. It still activates internal alarms. It still feels like vulnerability they were never taught how to hold. And yet what makes this dynamic so powerful is not that it removes fear instantly, but that it changes the experience of fear itself. Instead of fear being met with pressure, it is met with calm. Instead of withdrawal being met with punishment, it is met with space. And slowly the nervous system begins to learn something new. That closeness does not always lead to loss of self. And for someone who has spent most of their emotional life protecting themselves from emotional overwhelm, that realization is not small. It is transformative in ways they do not immediately understand. This is also where confusion begins to rise within them, because they are used to relationships that follow predictable emotional patterns. Intensity leads to closeness, closeness leads to pressure, pressure leads to withdrawal, withdrawal leads to conflict. But now, that cycle is disrupted. There is no emotional chase, there is no collapse, there is no dramatic reaction that confirms their fears. Instead, there is stability, and stability is something they are not trained to respond to. So internally, they begin to watch more closely. They begin to think more about the person who does not react the way others did. And without realizing it, emotional attention starts to shift. Not because they are being pursued, but because they are no longer being emotionally overwhelmed. And in that absence of chaos, curiosity starts to grow. And curiosity, once it enters the emotional system of someone who is used to avoiding closeness, does something very specific. It doesn't immediately turn into love, and it doesn't immediately turn into attachment. Instead, it creates attention. And attention is far more powerful than most people realize, because attention is where emotional energy begins to shift direction. At first, they don't even understand why they are thinking about it so often. It might happen in small moments, a memory that appears out of nowhere, a conversation that replays in their mind longer than expected, a feeling that something about that connection was different, even if they cannot explain why. And the more they try to dismiss it, the more it quietly returns. This is not emotional obsession in the dramatic sense. It is something much quieter and more internal. It feels like their mind is circling around something unresolved, not because it is painful, but because it is unfinished. And what makes it unfinished is not conflict. It is the absence of conflict, the absence of drama, the absence of emotional chaos that they are usually familiar with. Because when someone is used to intense emotional patterns, calmness feels incomplete. Their nervous system is trained to interpret emotional intensity as significance. So when something feels stable, consistent, and emotionally grounded, it does not immediately register as important. It registers as unfamiliar, and unfamiliar things are often processed slowly, not instantly. This is where the internal shift begins to deepen. They start noticing something unusual about themselves. They are not reacting the same way they usually do. The urge to escape is still there, but it is weaker than before. The emotional distance they normally rely on still exists, but it is no longer as automatic. There is now something interrupting it, a subtle hesitation, a moment of pause before pulling away. And that pause is everything. Because in that pause, something new is forming. A space where emotion is no longer being immediately shut down. A space where they are forced, even briefly, to feel instead of escape. And in that space, the presence they once considered too calm or too steady starts to become something else entirely. It starts to feel safe in a way they are not used to naming. But safety, for someone who is emotionally avoidant, is not immediately comforting. It can feel unsettling at first, because safety requires exposure, and exposure requires vulnerability. And vulnerability is exactly what they have learned to regulate through distance. So now they are caught in a quiet internal conflict. One part of them still wants control, still wants distance, still wants emotional independence without interference. But another part of them is beginning to notice something softer, something unfamiliar, a pull that does not feel like pressure, but like calm curiosity. And the confusing part is that nothing is forcing them to choose either direction. There is no emotional crisis pushing them. There is only presence, steady, grounded, non-reactive presence. And that kind of presence does something powerful over time. It starts to feel like an emotional reference point, a baseline, something their mind returns to when everything else feels too loud or too unstable. At this stage, they may not express anything outwardly. In fact, from the outside, it may look like nothing is changing at all. They may still seem distant. They may still seem controlled. They may still seem emotionally unavailable. But internally, something is shifting that they are not yet ready to articulate. They begin comparing emotional experiences without even realizing it. Interactions that once felt normal now feel slightly more draining. Conversations that once felt exciting now feel slightly more chaotic. And in contrast, the memory of that steady presence starts to feel increasingly different, not louder, not more intense, just more grounded. And this comparison slowly changes emotional preference. It doesn't happen as a decision, it happens as a feeling a quiet reorganization of emotional comfort. The mind begins to lean toward what feels stable, even if the personality still resists it. And that resistance is important because it shows that change is not immediate, it is layered, it is internal, it is gradual. This is also where emotional reflection begins to surface. They start to think more deeply about their own behavior in relationships, not necessarily in a judgmental way, but in a questioning way. Why do they pull away when things feel close? Why do they feel overwhelmed when someone gets too emotionally available? Why does closeness sometimes feel like pressure instead of comfort? These questions do not always come with answers, but they begin to exist in the background of their mind. And once these questions exist, emotional patterns are no longer unconscious, they become observable. And when something becomes observable, it becomes changeable. This is where the emotional dynamic shifts again. Because now, the distance that once felt like protection starts to feel slightly less effective. It still works, but not in the same satisfying way. It no longer fully erases emotional awareness. It no longer fully resets the internal system. Something lingers now, a sense that not everything is being escaped, not everything is being controlled. And that lingering feeling is the beginning of emotional vulnerability. Meanwhile, the steady presence they once underestimated continues to remain unchanged. No chasing, no emotional pressure, no sudden reactions, no attempts to force closeness. And this consistency becomes increasingly significant because it contrasts sharply with everything else they have experienced. And contrast is what deepens emotional perception. The more unstable their internal or external emotional world feels, the more noticeable stability becomes. And slowly, without anyone forcing it, emotional attention begins to return again and again to the same place. Not because it is loud, but because it is stable enough to hold attention without overwhelming it. At this stage, something subtle begins to happen internally. They start to feel drawn without understanding why. Not in a dramatic way, not in a desperate way, but in a quiet way that is harder to ignore each time it appears. It might show up as wanting to reconnect, or thinking about reaching out, or simply remembering moments more often than before. And each time this happens, it challenges their usual emotional instinct. Because their usual instinct is distance. But now distance does not feel as automatic as it used to. There is a competing force inside them, a force that is not loud but persistent, a feeling that something important is being left unfinished if they fully detach. And this is where emotional tension begins to build. Not between two people, but within one person. Between the part that wants safety through distance and the part that is starting to recognize safety in presence. And neither side fully wins yet, but both begin to exist at the same time. And that is exactly where transformation begins. And that internal tension doesn't resolve quickly. In fact, it becomes the most emotionally important stage of the entire dynamic. Because when someone is caught between wanting distance and feeling drawn toward connection, they are no longer operating from automatic patterns. They are now in awareness. And awareness is where emotional change quietly begins to take shape, even when the person experiencing it is still resisting it. At this point, something subtle happens in their emotional perception. The idea of closeness is no longer just linked with discomfort. It starts to carry mixed signals. On one hand, it still feels exposing, unpredictable, and slightly overwhelming. But on the other hand, it is no longer completely foreign or undesirable. There is now memory attached to it. Memory of calm, memory of stability, memory of not being judged, chased, or pressured. And memory changes emotional interpretation more than most people realize. Because avoidance is not just a behavior, it is also a learned emotional map, a map that tells someone what closeness means, what distance means, and how to survive emotional intensity. But when new experiences do not match the old map, the system begins to hesitate. It no longer reacts instantly. It starts to compare, it starts to question, and in that questioning, something very important is happening beneath the surface. The emotional system is updating. Not through logic, not through conversation, but through experience that repeats without pressure. And that repetition matters, because the steady presence remains steady. The emotional environment does not collapse when distance appears. There is no punishment. There is no withdrawal of warmth as retaliation. There is no emotional chaos created in response to emotional distance. And over time, this consistency becomes the most disorienting yet healing experience for someone who is used to emotional instability. At first, they may not respond to it. They may even test it without realizing they are testing it, pulling away slightly to see what happens, staying silent longer than usual to observe the reaction, creating emotional space to confirm whether safety still remains even in absence. And when nothing breaks, something shifts, because the expectation of loss is not met. And when emotional loss does not follow distance, the nervous system starts to relax its grip on control. Not completely, not permanently, but in small moments, moments where they begin to feel that closeness might not automatically mean emotional danger. That realization is not spoken, it is felt. And feeling always comes before understanding. This is where attachment begins to form in a way that feels confusing to them, because they do not feel pulled in the way they expect. They feel something quieter, a return, a revisiting, a mental reorientation toward a specific emotional presence. It is not obsession in the way people assume. It is attention that keeps landing in the same place, even when they try to redirect it elsewhere. And what makes this even more powerful is that nothing is demanding that attention. There is no pressure pulling it. There is only consistency holding it. Meanwhile, their usual emotional strategies start to feel slightly less effective internally. Distance still works externally, but internally it does not bring the same relief. Instead of feeling fully detached, there is now residue, a lingering awareness, a sense that something remains unresolved even after withdrawal, and unresolved emotion is what keeps connection alive in the background. At this stage, they may start to experience emotional contradiction more frequently. Moments where they feel fine being distant, followed by moments where they suddenly feel the absence more strongly than expected. Moments where independence feels empowering, followed by moments where it feels strangely empty. And this emotional inconsistency creates reflection, not forced reflection, not analytical reflection, but emotional reflection that arises naturally when internal patterns stop behaving predictably. They begin to notice themselves more, not in a critical way, but in a curious way. Why does certain emotional silence feel heavier now than it used to? Why does calmness in another person feel more noticeable than intensity? Why does something that once felt insignificant now feel memorable? These questions do not need answers immediately. Their power is in their existence. Because once a person starts questioning their emotional reactions, those reactions are no longer unconscious. They become visible. And what becomes visible can no longer operate purely on autopilot, and that is where transformation continues to deepen. The emotional pull toward the steady presence does not become stronger in a dramatic sense. It becomes more consistent. It stops disappearing completely. Even when distance is chosen, it returns. Even when attention is redirected, it reappears, not loudly, not urgently, but persistently enough to be noticed. And persistence is what slowly reshapes emotional priority, because the mind begins to associate emotional safety with that consistency. Not because it was told to, but because it was experienced repeatedly without disruption. And for someone whose internal system has been shaped by unpredictability, this kind of emotional stability is not just unfamiliar, it is compelling in a quiet, grounding way. But here is where the most important shift begins. Because as emotional attachment starts forming, fear does not disappear. It intensifies in a different direction. Fear of dependency, fear of vulnerability, fear of losing control over emotional distance, fear of being seen too clearly, fear of needing something that cannot be easily detached from. And this fear creates resistance. Not necessarily visible resistance, but internal resistance, moments of pulling back again, moments of re-establishing distance, moments of trying to regain emotional control after feeling too much closeness internally. And yet, even in resistance, the connection is not erased. It remains present in the background, unchanged by distance. And that is what makes it unforgettable. Because what is steady does not demand emotional energy. It simply exists. And in a world of emotional fluctuation, what simply exists becomes increasingly significant over time. This is the point where internal emotional conflict becomes almost unavoidable. The part that values independence still tries to lead, but the part that has experienced emotional safety begins to resist complete withdrawal, and neither side fully dominates anymore. Instead, they coexist, and coexistence is the beginning of emotional transformation that cannot be reversed by avoidance alone. Because once someone has experienced emotional safety without pressure, they cannot fully unfeel it. They can ignore it. They can suppress it. They can distance themselves from it. But it remains recorded in their emotional system as a reference point. And reference points change everything. They become the silent standard against which all future emotional experiences are measured. And once something becomes a reference point inside the emotional system, it quietly changes how every other connection is experienced. Not in a dramatic way at first, but in a subtle recalibration of what feels tolerable, what feels safe, and what feels emotionally draining. The mind does not announce this shift. It simply starts reacting differently than before. People often assume emotional change happens through big moments, through conflict, through confession, through clear turning points. But in reality, the deepest shifts happen in silence, in repetition, in consistency that never breaks, even when tested. And for someone who has been shaped by emotional unpredictability, that consistency starts to leave an imprint that cannot easily be ignored. At this stage, something important begins to surface internally. The idea of distance no longer feels like full emotional control. It still creates space, but it no longer creates the same sense of relief it once did. Instead, it now carries awareness that something is being temporarily set aside rather than fully removed. And that difference matters. Because avoidance depends on the illusion of emotional reset, the belief that if you step far enough away, feel little enough, detach long enough, the emotional intensity will disappear. But when something continues to exist in memory without pressure, without chasing, without emotional punishment, it stops behaving like something that can be easily erased. It becomes something that is carried, not consciously at first, but emotionally. And this is where internal resistance begins to weaken in a very specific way. Not because fear disappears, but because fear is no longer the only emotional force present. There is now something competing with it. A sense of ease that was previously absent, a recognition that closeness does not always lead to emotional loss of self, that connection does not always require emotional sacrifice. And that realization does not arrive as a belief, it arrives as experience, which is why it is so powerful. Because experience bypasses logic, it does not need permission to stay in the system. Over time, this creates a quiet shift in emotional priorities, not a decision, not a choice, but a tendency. A subtle leaning toward what feels steady, even if part of the mind still resists it, and that leaning becomes more noticeable in moments of emotional uncertainty. When life feels overwhelming, when internal emotional noise rises, when external relationships feel unpredictable, the mind begins to return to what does not activate survival responses, and that return is not intentional, it is automatic. It happens in thoughts first. A memory appears without being invited. A feeling resurfaces without a trigger. A sense of calm is associated with a specific emotional presence that does not demand anything in return. And the more this happens, the more emotionally significant it becomes. But at the same time, resistance does not disappear. In fact, it often becomes sharper in response to this growing pull. Because the deeper someone feels something they cannot fully control, the stronger their instinct becomes to reassert distance, to re-establish emotional boundaries, to remind themselves of independence, to step back before attachment deepens further. This creates a cycle that is no longer simple avoidance, it is now push and pull within the same internal space. And that internal push and pull is exhausting in a way that is not visible to others. From the outside, nothing may seem changed. They may still appear composed, still appear distant, still appear emotionally self-contained, but internally, they are no longer operating from emotional certainty. They are operating from emotional contradiction. And contradiction always seeks resolution, even if unconsciously. This is where emotional fixation begins to form more clearly, not in the sense of obsession, but in the sense of repeated emotional return, thoughts that circle back, moments that replay, curiosity that refuses to fully dissolve. And what makes it stronger is not intensity, but stability. Because unstable emotions are easy to disconnect from, but stable emotional experiences that feel safe, non-invasive and non-demanding are harder to categorize. They do not create urgency, they create reflection, and reflection lasts longer than reaction. At this stage, emotional distance still exists, but it is no longer emotionally empty. It now carries weight, it carries awareness of what is being distanced from, and that awareness changes everything. Because once you become aware of what you are stepping away from, stepping away no longer feels neutral. It feels like a choice. And choice introduces responsibility. Even if it is not acted on, even if it is never spoken. And this is where the emotional experience becomes even more complex. Because the presence that once felt like just calm now starts to feel like something that cannot be easily replaced, not because it is dramatic, but because it is consistent, and consistency, in a world of emotional fluctuation, becomes rare enough to be meaningful. So when distance increases again, it does not reset the system completely anymore. It leaves traces, emotional traces that linger in thought, in feeling, in subtle awareness, and those traces slowly build emotional weight. Meanwhile, internally, the idea of returning begins to form in fragmented ways, not as a full decision, not as an action, but as a thought that keeps reappearing, a possibility that the mind revisits without fully committing to it. And that is how emotional pull develops in someone who resists emotional pull, not through force, but through return, through repetition, through the inability of absence to fully erase presence, and eventually, something begins to shift that is not immediately obvious even to the person experiencing it. The emotional defense system that once automatically activated distance begins to hesitate, just slightly, just briefly, but enough to change the speed of emotional reaction. Instead of immediate withdrawal, there is now a pause, and in that pause, everything changes. Because pause is where awareness enters. And awareness is where control begins to loosen, not disappear, just loosen. And that is where the emotional dynamic reaches its most important turning point. Because at this stage, it is no longer just about distance or closeness, it is about recognition. Recognition that something has been felt that cannot be completely undone, something that does not demand attention but still receives it, something that does not chase but still remains present in thought. And when emotional presence becomes internal rather than external, it no longer needs proximity to exist. It simply stays. And what stays inside the mind long enough eventually becomes part of emotional identity.